Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Runeterra Report, Mastering Runeterra's weekly podcast, filling you in on everything you'll need to know for the upcoming week of Runeterra at a breakneck pace. I'm your host, DarwinTheory, NA Masters player and two-time Seasonals attendee, here to guide you through the meta for the week of November 21st, 2022. Without any further ado, let's dive right in and explore what you'll have to keep an eye on for this week of Runeterra. And to get us started, let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. Teemo Zoe, last week's Merry Misfits turned meta menace, are still standing strong atop the meta, although with some cracks showing in the armor. As per usual, when a deck becomes this dominant, counters always rise up, and Teemo Zoe has seen some of its worst matchups rear their heads once again. You still lose to the very popular discard, the resurgent Field of Rush doesn't look great either, and multiple Piltover Shadow Isles control blends can give you a nasty headache. Annie TF is the worst matchup of all, however, and only continues to get more popular. Watch out! To fight off these counters, a set of Sparkle Flies has been performing very well, and 2 copies of Bandle Tellstones also look like an interesting experiment. I predicted that this deck's matchups were just a little too polarizing for it to threaten to completely dominate the meta, and I may be correct, but for the time being, it's still your best climbing choice, and an excellent deck to be sure. Still just as present as last week in terms of play rate, the discarding duo of Draven and Jinx are falling victim to a more developed meta as their win rate slightly dips. Trundle Tryndamere Field of Rush coming back is an absolute nightmare for this classic aggro mix, with the same being true of the Piltover Shadow Isles control decks, Echo Jinx, Kayn Vayne, and Annie TF. You still dominate Ginny and Elusives, but discard definitely looks to be falling off rapidly as answers pop up among the meta. Just like I said last week, Rearguard and Draven's biggest fan are 1-drops that should be run far more often. As time has gone on, Precious Pet and Legion Saboteur have also shown their value in this deck. It seems as though you just need to run more 1-drops for this deck to perform a little bit better in the current landscape if you're really adamant about continuing with the discarders. And almost as if to spite me for making the claim that the deck rarely advances past the fringes of the meta last week, Red Gwen has shot up to dominance and doesn't look to be slowing down anytime soon. Looking at the deck's matchup spread though, it makes perfect sense. Among your 15 most popular matchups, not one of them is below a 48% win rate for Gwen and Katarina. Depending on how exactly you build and pilot this archetype, nearly everything can be winnable. Among popular decks, your only real concern is Celesbians, which is currently plummeting as some of its worst matchups become more popular. While this archetype is still far from solved, and no two people like to build it exactly the same way due to its natural flexibility, I would like to remind everyone again that Legion Rearguard is a fantastic card. Among other popular and strong inclusions, I'm seeing multiple copies of RuneSquire and House Spider, and even Shadow Isles Tellstones looks like it offers some strong appeal for the deck. Contrary to what my pessimism last week might have made you think, Red Gwen is as legit gets, and a good player can pilot this archetype to some crazy heights once you learn the matchups because nearly anything is winnable. And back from the dead to wreak some serious havoc on the meta, Trundle Tryndamere Field of Rush saw a ladder full of aggro decks and decided it was time to absolutely ruin some folks' climbing sessions. While Red Gwen is an abysmal matchup, and Talia Ziggs, Pantheris, and Quinn Vayne are even worse, you do otherwise have a very positive matchup spread into your top 15 decks. This classic control archetype absolutely creams several of the popular aggro decks, and some slower control lists can't effectively shut you down either because of the Field of Rush combo. I'm seeing some high value from a single Commander Ledros and 1 copy of the box, and 2 copies of the recently buffed Troll Scavenger are actually performing excellently since he's now more defensively statted. If you're running into plenty of board-based decks on ladder, a single Flash Freeze might also start to look pretty nice to shut down those scary attacks. Field of Rush has always been a meta call, and right now the meta is most certainly calling for the beefy Overwhelmers to clean house on ladder. And just as with last week, there are still a couple of Vayne archetypes kicking around in the fringes. In a bizarre twist, however, the most popular version of the bunch is now the Kayn variant. Vayne Quinn PNZ is still good, and I would definitely recommend playing it, especially since its matchup spread seems a bit more stable with less polarizing matchups, but Kayn isn't to be ignored any longer. They both fare decently into most popular decks, beating the popular Shadow Isles control list, but Annie TF is a nightmare for any Vayne deck, it seems. I've been an advocate for a single copy of Silence and Suppress in most Demacia decks since the card's release, and it's currently looking fantastic. We're talking 65% win rate fantastic. Try it and see how you feel in either of the lists. I think Kayn players should experiment with Ranger Knight Defector, Single Combat, Lunari Cultist, Fish Fight, the Expanse's Protection, and Heedless Resurrection. 1 or 2 copies of each could be seriously dangerous. Quinn Piltover players should try out Chempunk Pickpocket, Parts Made Whole, Concerted Strike, and the newly buffed Laurent Duelist. Somehow, even after all of this time, these archetypes aren't even really close to completely solved. Try these suggestions and more and see what you can do, because these decks are pretty similar to Gwen Cat in that most games are winnable for the players at the top of their game. And Annie TF Ravenbloom is still kicking and still just as polarizing as ever. It really struggles into most of the new Shadow Isles control, and it isn't particularly fond of Gwen Katarina being around either, but it demolishes popular aggro and Vayne lists. This is another archetype with a bit of solving left to be done. Fortune Croaker, Spellslinger, and House Spider are all 2-drops that serve vastly different purposes but all look really solid. Experiment with 1 or 2 copies of each and see which you like best. This suggestion will sound like some real spice, and I can't guarantee if it'll be successful, but I'm quite fond of Loaded Vessel in specifically this archetype. Everything that the card wants to do benefits the core cards of your list, and 1 or 2 copies of Loaded Vessel could really be the wild card to swing a game in your favor. As I said last week, all this deck really needs is less control in the meta to go from pretty solid to absolutely dominant. While it's definitely not quite ready to fully take over yet, Panthera stocks are in fact rising as I projected. You still face unplayable matchups into Discard, Elusives, and Ginny, but 2 of those 3 seem to be in their fall-off phases right now. You absolutely run through nearly everything else in your top 10, with 55% win rate matchups being quite common among your most popular opponents. I hate to reiterate myself for the 3rd consecutive week, but until I see Ayula included in more than half of lists, I'm going to keep campaigning for you to include 1 copy of her. This deck is almost completely solved, but you will perform better with a single Ayula, and I implore you to at least try her out. Keep waiting, Paris players. A little more meta development, and I've got a feeling that you're going to be sweetly rewarded. There are actually 2 separate Piltover Shadow Isles control decks that are in meta right now, but their matchup spreads are near identical, so I'm going to take this opportunity to call them both out at once. Heimer Jace Shadow Isles surpassed my expectations from last week, managing to cling to the meta, at least for the time being, and they're joined by Seraphine and Victor, a pairing we're all familiar with from last patch. These decks both destroy the 3 popular aggro decks, but suffer against Gwen Cat and feel the rush. Echo Jinx is good news for each of them, but Talia Ziggs, Pantheon Varus, and Quinn Vayne are a nightmare. The only real difference in their matchup spreads is that Seraphine and Victor run over the card-sharpened Kindergartner Annie TF Ravenbloom, whereas the arcane duo of Heimer and Jace fall flat on their faces in that matchup. For Seraphine and Victor, there are plenty of cards with a sub 10% pick rate that are performing excellently as one-ofs, so I'll just throw out a few in a lightning round. Aloof Travelers, Withering Wail, Static Shock, Hexpliterator, Piercing Darkness, Pursuit of Perfection, Iterative Improvement, Poro Cannon, and Death Ray. All of these could be good, and I've already talked at length previously about how Seraphine loves her one-ofs, especially post-nerf, so try some of these out. Heimer and Jace seem to perform well with Aftershock, The Box, Withering Wail, Albus Pharos, The Forge of Tomorrow, and Assembly Line. Again, we're all talking one-ofs here. I'm still not the most confident in these decks, since they will look a lot worse if the 3 aggro kings fall out of meta and if Red Gwen rises even higher, but for the time being, they're worth looking at. Another deck that might start to see its fortunes shift with a meta change is Talia Ziggs. The deck has a reasonably similar matchup spread to Gwen Katarina, it's just a little bit worse. You lose your losing matchups harder, and sometimes you lose matchups that Gwen Katarina would win, but in general, you prefer to see a control deck across from you, and you can be too explosive for some of these slower decks to handle. The aggro kings are bad news, with your matchups against Discard, Ginny, and Elusives being at 45%, 39%, and 30% respectively. But if they get pushed out of meta, Talia Ziggs could definitely have a place for people who don't enjoy playing Red Gwen. The archetype is nearly solved, but I'd recommend a full set of Waste Walkers to make your good matchups even better, and 2 copies of Desert Naturalist does seem to be the proper number. Safety Inspector is curiously absent from the stats on this list this week, so it may be worth trying 2 copies of him as well, but I can't guarantee how successful you'll be. Experiment and see where it leads you. Everyone's favorite space lesbians are starting to look a little bit shaky, and the polarizing nature of their matchup spread might finally be coming back around to bite them. Diana and Leona do perform excellently against the resurgent Red Gwen, but some of the other top decks are looking really dicey. Sub 45 into Annie TF and Heimer Jace, sub 35 into Kane Vayne, and a losing matchup against Fielder Rush don't seem to spell a ton of success for this duo right now. You do crush Discard and Ginny, but they're probably in the process of disappearing from the meta right now. You beat Seraphine Victor, Tali Ziggs, and Quinn Vane, but that's about where the good news ends. The deck is absolutely still playable, but you may find some games just too difficult, and it might be easier to pursue another deck to climb with. That being said, the deck is still undergoing plenty of optimization. Versions opting for more removal with Vengeance and Sunburst are looking better, and Solari Stellicorn might be worth a look as a one-of inclusion. Moonlit Glenkeeper is still fantastic, and I still think that one-of Hush is the best way to go. Overall, the most devoted players can definitely make this pairing work, but if you want quick and easy LP, I'd urge you somewhere else for the time being while the meta temporarily trends away from these two. Alright, it's that time of the day again, my friends. The radioactive hazard pile has returned, and it's got some much more controversial names this week. For those who don't know, this segment highlights decks that I would completely avoid recommending, either for the time being because the meta's shifted completely away from them, or in the case of troll archetypes like Reaver's Row, I'd recommend away from them permanently. For one, I'm actually going to put Ginny here for this week. I know that the deck has been a constant for a while now, but it's just found itself a victim to the successes of its aggro peers. Because Elusives and Discard got so popular alongside Ginny, decks that could target them also got more popular. Many of these decks happen to also absolutely thrash Annie Jin, and it's hard to ignore how much red there is in the matchup spread. Having 8 sub-40% matchups in your top 15 most played is incredibly hard to justify, especially when some of those are even sub-35. You just lose too many matchups when you could be playing another aggro deck that would perform better. I'm recommending against Annie Jin this week. For the same reason, I'm going to dump Echo Jinx in the pile. The deck was fun and experimental, but with a few notable exceptions, your matchup spread is full of red. You beat Ginny, which means next to nothing, since nearly everyone beats Ginny these days, and it won't be long before people realize that and stop playing the deck. The same is true of Discard, which is falling from grace as we speak, and once you remove those two, you have precisely 2 positive matchups among popular decks that aren't ephemerals, because ephemerals are a joke right now. You beat Celesmians and Red Gwen by relatively small margins, and that's just not enough for me to recommend the deck when you've got so many matchups in the low mid-40s. By the way, yeah, ephemerals, let's just sweep those guys under the carpet, please. It's been like 3 weeks now, and they just keep getting worse and worse every time I glance at the stats. You beat Feel the Rush, and basically only Feel the Rush. Abandon all hope, you who lock this deck. It's bad. It's fun. It's bad. Nora's Spooky Tea Party has officially been crashed, with nearly every one of its flavors now being crushed under its terrible matchup spreads. You have better Shadow Isles control options for the time being, and I would recommend you take them, but we can get back to experimenting with Nora once the meta changes a little bit in her favor. Well everyone, that'll be just about everything for this week's Runeterra report here on Mastering Runeterra. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening until the end. If you have any questions or concerns about the podcast, please feel free to hit me up through the Mastering Runeterra Discord server or personally at DarwinTheory9305. Massive shoutouts to MasteringRuneterra.com for making this all happen, as well as every individual affiliated with the site who helped me piece together the data that I needed for this podcast. Other special shoutouts go to the folks behind LOR.GG, as well as Balco's and Legna's websites. Gathering data isn't easy, but when I can cross-reference with such reliable sources, it's a massive help to make sure that I know that what I'm talking about is correct. The folks at Mastering Runeterra post quite often, so if you aren't already a regular, I'd highly recommend that you swing by and see what's in store. We've got meta tier lists, matchup spreads, and a best-of-3 ban helper for you tournament players out there, all updated every few hours to ensure that we've got the best data out there. We also have articles posted by top players who know their stuff nearly every single day, so you'll be sure to find something you like no matter where you look. This has been Darwin Theory, and on behalf of everyone at Mastering Runeterra, I'd like to thank you for tuning in and wish you all a successful week of laddering. I hope to see you next week, when we see what takes the place of the most popular aggro decks as the meta's refined. Happy climbing!